Excellent. Thank you, Ian. And also thank you for having me. Um, Let me just move my display. So yeah, as you've said, good morning to everyone, good afternoon, potentially good evening, wherever you might be and what time it might be there. And or if you're watching the recording at a future date, thanks for looking it up and checking out this topic. As Ian mentioned, I'm here to talk about RG Check and its ability to promote continuous improvement through accreditation. Ian mentioned that I'm with the Responsible Gambling Council. My position is the Associate Director of the RG Check program. So I get to work with a wonderful team, not only at our organization, but specifically in our department as we work on the RG Check program. So today I'm going to first introduce a little bit about the Responsible Gambling Council, sort of who we are, what we do, and then really dive into RG Check accreditation, going over the standards that make up the accreditation, what the structure is, and ultimately what the process is, before moving on to talking about its role in continuous improvement. So depending on, what your interest is or your past experience is, perhaps you've done RG Check in the past, you have RG Check. Some of this information may be a refresh or well known by you, but hoping to share some insights and observations and a new perspective on the results in that latter part of the presentation today. So starting off, just kind of really high level, the Responsible Gambling Council, where RGC is where I work. We're an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to problem gambling prevention. We are a Canadian organization, but also work, across Canada, around the globe, as a leader in responsible gambling. Our history goes back a long time. Originally established in 1983, RGC now has over 40 years of experience in research, prevention, education, accreditation, and policy guidance. And as an organization, we sort of champion ourselves as being gambling neutral and taking a 360 approach to our work in working with all gambling partners and the public in order to prevent problem gambling, reduce its risks, and promote sustainable and responsible play. In order to do that, we've got a variety of departments, programs that we've developed and currently offer. Most simply, they can kind of fall into two categories. Our programs for industry, the sort of B2B, as well as our programs for the public, the sort of B2C category. So on the industry side, first and foremost, I will highlight RG Check, our accreditation program for land-based casinos and iGaming sites. But we do also offer research and advisory services under our RG Plus group. They will put out research, training, and evaluations. We have an industry newsletter called NewsScan, where we share sort of the latest research and events on a weekly basis, as well as our Discovery Conference, an annual conference that we put on in Toronto, bringing together thought leaders around discussions on the sort of latest topics and trends in the industry. On the public-facing side, we have a number of innovative and exciting programs for different audiences. Largely focused on education. There's a high school program called Game Brain, geared towards youth under 18 or under 19, as well as programs for college and universities and community level programming. And then ultimately, we do also operate and work in partnership with the Ontario Lottery Corporation to staff and deliver the programming available at the PlaySmart centers in casinos and bingo, charitable gaming venues across the province of Ontario here in Canada. But the reason that we're all here today and the aspect of RGC's work that I represent and I'm going to speak to today is RG Check. And so, as I've mentioned, it's an accreditation program. Ultimately, it's meant to be a concrete roadmap for operators to identify and implement effective responsible gambling initiatives. Our mission is to support the adoption of meaningful RG initiatives through the creation and implementation of measurable evidence-informed standards. Um, Not only do we have the RG Check Index, the sort of standards and criteria, but we have an accreditation process that helps to strengthen the relationship between regulators, operators, and players, and provides the kind of guidance and accountability to demonstrate the effective programming in a transparent manner. So getting into what RG Check is, ideally, it's meant to be aligned with compliance, audit, and risk management objectives. Um, it is a fairly long-standing program here at RGC. It's comprises of a set of industry-relevant and evidence-based standards. To date, we've completed over 200 unique accreditations and are currently active in many jurisdictions across Canada as well as internationally. Um, I mentioned that they're fairly long-standing. So our accreditations for land-based venues and online gaming sites are two unique accreditations. The first land-based accreditation of the launch of the program was back in 2010. So we have more than a decade of experience working with the standards and delivering accreditations. That was most recently updated in 2020. And then we also launched shortly after an online accreditation in 2013 that was subsequently updated in 2021. A big component of that update was not only looking at the content of the existing standards, but also to incorporate sports betting, a growing sort of line of business offered by a lot of operators. We had originally sort of looked into and done some research to potentially develop a third accreditation specific and unique to sports betting. But through that work, identified the strong overlap between the existing standards for online casino along with sports betting offerings. And so we're able to roll that up into one accreditation that is able to look at both of those aspects, or if an operator has only one of those line of business, the standards are flexible enough in order to look at just one aspect. So speaking of the updates that we were able to complete in 2020 and 2021, those were largely to make sure that the standards were being maintained, staying relevant, keeping up with best practice and innovations in technology. So we did a research scan, environmental scan, consulted with our stakeholders, our current clients, our people who are not clients, just to get their input and to get a variety of different jurisdictions represented as well. And I wanted to highlight what sort of our main areas of focus, both in that review and update, but as well as just sort of the underlying principles that we keep in mind with our standards. The first being the player experience. The accreditation is unique to an individual casino or to a specific online site. Part of the reason for that is that it is really focused on what is a player's experience visiting a given casino or site. Therefore, if there's a large operator that has casinos, in multiple states or provinces, and they've got a uniform program, we're still interested in knowing how that program is implemented at a given casino, so that if John or Mary walks into that casino, what information are they going to see? What is their experience going to be as a unique player? That's why things like the RG culture at a specific venue are important. Performance outcomes, not just the design of programs, but actually how they're being delivered and being received at a given space, as well as identifying and respecting the diverse needs for player information. Not every piece of information is going to be received by every player. We did see the rollout of QR codes. Those have been great. But there's still a need for variety in the delivery of information. The second area of focus is gambling harms. So considering gambling harms beyond sort of problem gambling, emphasizing the identification and responding to high-risk players. So what are procedures for initiating interactions, outcomes of interactions, as well as sort of information to be provided through those. As well as to recognize the significance of financial harm. When we did our updates, wanted to incorporate and strengthen the areas where that was. Not only financial harms to individuals, but as well looking at affected others. For financial harm extends beyond just the individual. And so that's an important aspect to have highlighted and strengthened when we did our update. Last piece, last area of focus, I should say, is around transparency and innovation. And so wanted to make updates where technology had progressed, the ability to provide information in new and novel ways was captured, as well as the underlying principles of informed choice and the duty of care. So through an operator, the duty of care is probably one of the strongest underlying principles across all of our standards in order to provide player protection in a sustainable environment. I spoke about the many jurisdictions that we've been able to take RG Check to. And so across Canada, a number of provinces, we've had longstanding relationships and have been able to accredit sites from coast to coast, I can fairly say, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, across Ontario, PEI, and Nova Scotia. The pins don't do justice to the geography and the number of sites within each of those provinces, but give you some idea. And then internationally, we've been able to take and apply our standards through RG Check accreditations in a number of international destinations, including Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Macau, Cyprus, and a couple of sites in Australia. What's been really interesting is being able to apply our standards in unique environments and sort of cultures, and going back to those principles, really focusing in on what is the principle, even when there are different ways to approach achieving that. So I've talked a little bit about what some of the benefits are, but really wanted to stop and highlight some of that. So the role that standards can play in setting an organization's objectives, defining strategies, and achieve those objectives are ways that they can help to manage the risk. And so through RG Check, it does provide a monitoring and risk management component, culture building, demonstrating accountability and transparency, and ultimately measuring impact. What I mean by some of these is that it can help translate an operator's commitments and intentions into demonstrable outcomes. So, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes policies, programs are set at a higher level. The corporation, perhaps the regulator has some aspects that they mandate, and how that is being sort of expressed and delivered at the individual site level is something that RG Check can help identify and demonstrate. The process itself is a tangible action. I'll go into greater detail what the process looks like, but it can be an opportunity to engage your employees on the importance of responsible gambling, the initiatives that are in place, and really involve them in the undertaking. And then lastly, we'll get into this again later with the continuous improvement, but it's an opportunity to demonstrate accountability and transparency. It's a scored approach, and so that not only the scores, but the final outcome of being accredited is something that can be externally reported and shown to other stakeholders as a sign that the program has met a certain standard. So speaking of the standards, we have two sets of standards that facilitate our accreditations in both the lines of business. So we have a set of standards for venues that consist of 8 standards, and a separate one for iGaming, which consists of 9. You'll see that there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of the initial standard areas. The first 6 through to marketing communications are aligned in terms of both lines of business, and then some departure on the later standards that are more representative of the sort of the product and the player experience. So on the menu side, access to money within the facility, as well as the venue and game design, while on iGaming, more focused on the account features, payments, the product design itself, as well as an additional standard area on stakeholder engagement. The intention with stakeholder engagement being that iGaming sites are often located quite far or potentially quite far from where their player base is, as opposed to a land-based venue. And so some additional measures to identify, engage with, and recognize the importance of the various stakeholders of where they're operating, but also where they're offering their products. Built down from our standards is sort of a hierarchy. So each of our standards, regardless of venue or iGaming, drill down into various criteria and subsequently indicators and evidence. And this is ultimately what makes up RG Check. And so we have the standard areas. They are more specific in the criteria that make them up. And then the evidence and indicators are the number of evidence pieces and specific proof points that we use to evaluate the criteria and standards. So the example here is just taking one from our first standard on RG policy, strategy, and culture. Within that standard, one of the criteria is specific to RG culture. And then in terms of evidence and indicators, RG culture, one way that we evaluate it is through the accountability. What are or how is accountability for RG established within the venue? And then the actual evidence piece is things like org charts, terms of reference, policies in terms of reporting structure to demonstrate that accountability. I'll go through the next slides fairly quickly. I've included for our iGaming standards the criteria. Excuse me. I'll preface this by saying that all of our standards and the criteria are available on our website. And so we want people to reference them. They're not sort of a secret. And so please take a look, use them in any way that might be beneficial to you in sort of structuring or organizing any initiatives that you might be undertaking. So this first one, RG's policy, strategy, and culture, you'll see that there's a number of criteria that make it up, including the RG culture one that I just referenced in the example before. Subsequently, going through each of the standards, we have the criteria outlined with some high-level definitions. You'll see that the criteria differ by each standard in terms of the number. And in a second, when I explain how we approach our scoring, I'll get into that a little bit more. On decision-making, marketing and communications, accounts and payment, site and product, all the way through to our stakeholder engagement. So earlier I mentioned that it's a scorecard approach. So both our iGaming and our land-based accreditations Through the accreditation process, we evaluate and score a given venue or site. Um, and in order to achieve accreditation, you must meet certain thresholds, including a 70% score overall, as well as a minimum of 50% in each standard area. The 50% in each standard is fairly straightforward, sort of a passing grade for each standard. And then for the overall, there is actually weighting assigned to the different standards. So there are some variation in terms of the weights, putting some more emphasis on different program pieces relative to others. So the table's there. There is a second one for the land-based. And you'll note some differences, and those are to account for differences between sort of the standard area versus the line of business. So our land-based has a bit of a stronger emphasis on employee training and assisting players, given the role that casino staff play in being the sort of frontline customer-facing interactions. Whereas informed decision-making and sort of site design might be more important on the iGaming sphere of things. The thresholds are the same though, with the 70% and 50%. And if unsuccessful in achieving accreditation, or rather these thresholds, applicants have up to 6 months to make modifications and be reassessed. So ultimately, the process is meant to get people to a point of accreditation by identifying what aspects might be missing and what areas might need some additional work. One last piece I wanted to share when speaking of all those criteria is the fact that the criteria are also scored. And so they are all scored on a 0 to 4 basis. And then those scores are what determine the percentage score in each standard area. They, however, are equally weighted. And so when I mentioned that there were a different amount of criteria per standard, that will have some reflection on the weighting. So a criteria that has 4 or a standard that has 4 criteria, if you've got 4, 4, 0, and 0, that would be 50%. But likewise, if you've got 2, 2, 2, and 2, that would also be 50%. Getting now into the process, I'll be relatively quick here so we can get to the continuous improvement part. We have a sort of defined process for every venue or site that undergoes accreditation. Really focused on data collection. Sort of the cornerstone is collecting evidence to validate the design, operation, and delivery of RG programs. Those then culminate in a site visit or review. Our iGaming ones we're able to do remotely, test sites, run surveys, interview employees remotely. With our land-based, we do a site visit to each casino, take a look back of house, front of house. We do a mock self-exclusion, as well as conduct some interviews and surveys in person. Once we've completed all of our activities, we're able to finalize our scoring across all the standards and criteria before ultimately pulling it all together into a draft report that provides summary statements on the findings, as well as reports on the criteria and standard level scores. An iterative feedback process to ensure that nothing's been miscommunicated before a final review by our accreditation panel. Going through that fairly quickly, just wanted to highlight the key points of our data collection. So really starts off with a documentation review that's quite thorough and robust, as well as unique employee and player surveys. Again, this is specific to each site or specific to each casino, really trying to drill down and get that perspective on the staff and the player experience at a given casino. And then also employee interviews. Through this, we're able to collect the bulk of the evidence that we need to substantiate our scoring. And we request, look for, and use a vast variety of pieces of evidence from survey results, documentation, policies, email samples, minutes, in order to really get the full understanding of how the program is being delivered. And so we've sort of seen it all: screenshots, videos, radio scripts, facilitators' notes to in-person training, anything that can help substantiate and validate your program. Along with that, we do the player surveys and employee surveys, seek to get good representation from players, do our best to collect 100+ player surveys, as well as at least 35% response rate from employees on the employee survey. Conduct a number of interviews with employees in various roles and responsibilities. These are always quite enjoyable because we've had a chance to review quite a bit of documentation ahead of them, and really a chance to speak with employees that live and breathe it every day and can help kind of provide some context and understanding to all the documentation that we've reviewed. Overall, the process takes about 4 to 5 months from start to finish for all of the data collection activities through to our team compiling a report, quality assuring it, and working through sort of feedback and final panel review. I spoke a bit about it being a scorecard approach. So ultimately, this is sort of the executive summary that gets produced, is a comprehensive scorecard of the criteria scores for each of the criteria under each standard, as well as the standard scores and final percentage there at the bottom. Likewise, the report itself repeats the reporting of the criteria scores through the entire report, along with summary statements as to our findings and understanding of the program in each of those areas. Once completed, our accreditation is valid for 3 years, at which time a venue or site is welcome to undergo the process again to be reaccredited. And it's very much the same process and an opportunity to evaluate what's changed, what's been improved, and see what the current state is at that time. So now that I've gone over what RG Check is, what the process is like, wanted to spend some time talking about how it can be a driver of continuous improvement. Each individual site can be accredited. It can be its own tool to facilitate projects, program changes, initiatives that are identified through an individual review. But it also has some ability on a broader scale to be a driver of continuous improvement. So first off, standards themselves, they're everywhere. They're in multiple industries and used, from things like safety through to communicating or signaling to consumers a certain standard or expectation. As I touched on earlier, there's foundational principles that underlie standards, as well as they seek to address key risks. And a lot of the value lies in the continued monitoring, measuring, as well as sharing of that information. The last piece is that standards themselves evolve over time, affecting change across all. So at the beginning, I mentioned that RG Check updated its standards in 2020 and 2021. At the time when we did that, we evaluated the content and made changes to sort of raise the bar on the standards and the expectation moving forward. Once again, we find ourselves in that process at the current moment, hoping to by end of year or early next year, roll out further updates to our standards, keeping a pulse on what the latest research is and expectations, particularly with iGaming as a fairly rapidly evolving part of the industry. So some examples of how standards or the use of accreditation can be used, outside of a single site, really comes down to either operators that have multiple sites, um, stakeholders that have oversight or influence over multiple operators, as well as potentially government agencies that might want to use RG Check as a tool to have some commonality across operators and monitoring. So one example that I wanted to talk about was iGaming Ontario. They have made RG Check accreditation a requirement for responsible gambling, or one of their requirements under responsible gambling. They are the conduct and manage entity for the iGaming market in Ontario, and so saw RG Check as a tool that could be used to monitor and evaluate the performance of RG for all the operators coming into Ontario. What that really means in practice or in context with RG Check is the fact that as we've conducted individual accreditations with a number of operators, which are always unique and only shared with the client that we're working with, is that over time we're able to aggregate that data and provide benchmarks that show sort of those results against all of the results. So doing that, this is what that looks like. So on the yellow bars, you can see sort of the average scores of all Ontario accredited iGaming sites, as well as the gray bar that represents all iGaming accredited sites. And this information in its aggregate can be useful to pinpoint standard areas and performance across them. Likewise, we're able to drill down because there is reporting on each of the criteria within the standards and do this on a more granular level, criteria by criteria within each standard. And at that level can identify even more targeted areas within programs of higher or lower performance overall, as well as higher or lower, say, deviation from the average overall. So this is where it gets exciting because it can be a driver of continuous improvement if they want to identify those areas and then take more targeted actions towards them. It can also be a great tool for individual operators. When we work with anyone individually, we'll always present this information of their results against a relevant average. And it can be really enlightening to see where you're overperforming or underperforming, and that sort of comparison can be a really great contextual point. So at one point we had what looked like a lot of operators, but was really just the beginning, as we kind of continue to add more operators into our averages. And there are quite a number of operators in Ontario. And so looking forward to continuing to add to those benchmarks as we have the opportunity to work with a number of operators in the market. But that's not the only example. There are plenty of other options for benchmarking that can help to drive continuous improvement. This is just a theoretical one. You can place casino A, B, and C against the overall average. So if you're an operator with multiple casinos, you can see how your various sites are doing relative to one another, as well as the overall. And then, as I mentioned, can drill down with those same breakdowns for each of the criteria within a standard. And oftentimes this is where you might start to see some more variation and some more sort of unique outcomes across sites that might be operating with a very similar sort of overarching program structure. And so why provide this kind of information? It helps to facilitate the sharing of best practice among sites and venues. Perhaps there's something that one venue is doing that's really being received well or executed easily that the other venues could model, and they just don't know. It also highlights venue level indicators and initiatives that take jurisdictional programs into account. So, oftentimes there might be something in the jurisdiction that's a requirement for all sites, but a certain venue or champions at a venue may take that and really add to it and make it much more successful than sort of the baseline requirement. So being able to identify those leaders and both sort of celebrate them as well as potentially learn from them. And then lastly, can be combined with other data points to get an even broader picture. Things like employee engagement surveys or other markers of venue performance. Just got a couple more slides before I'll turn it over to questions and potentially give you all back a couple minutes for your afternoon. So these are just a couple other potentialities of some of the benchmarks. So in this one, we specifically did a category for RG Check resorts. So thinking of integrated resorts, large venues, and comparing those against the average. We have a large cohort of casinos that we've accredited that fit different sort of size categories, from small community-based gaming facilities to medium-sized casinos to really large integrated resorts. And so being able to sort of drill down and create an average or benchmark that's more specific to an individual site can be a lot more informative than just the overall average. The second example, we do have a really large and robust average for Canadian casinos that we've accredited. So likewise, if we're doing an individual Canadian casino, we can both demonstrate to them their performance against a Canadian average as well as overall average. And that is all that I have for you folks today. My details are there if you do want to reach out, LinkedIn, email. Likewise, there's a wealth of information on RGC's website, including contact pages as well, if that's an easier way to reach out. So yeah, thank you everyone for taking the time out of your afternoon or morning or evening, if that's the case, to join us here. And thanks again to Ian and the association for inviting me and hosting me for this webinar.
Thanks very much for that, Bob. We have one question in the chat from Josephine. It goes, at the yearly check-in with RG after the main accreditation, are there any opportunities for improvement that can be provided by RGC?
Interesting. No, that's a great question. I didn't cover that, but for all of our existing accredited sites, the accreditation I mentioned was valid for a 3-year period. And what we do in the years in between, sort of year 1 and year 2 anniversary, is reach out to accredited site or venue and ask them. We utilize a short checklist to see if any major pieces of their program have changed. Part of that process is not necessarily to update any scores or provide any additional recommendations. But I will say that through our work with different sites and different stakeholders, we always welcome the opportunity to work collaboratively and provide insights on potential improvements. So when we kind of close accreditation, our reports also include recommendations. But if any of our clients over the intervening years ever have questions or have actioned those recommendations and might want to know what else they might be able to work on, they're more than welcome to reach out. We'd love to hear from them and continue to work with them.